Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Fighting Matters. My name's Stephan Kesting. I run Grapplearts.com, EssentialWilderness.com. My co-host today is Jeff Shaw from Bellingham, BJJ. And we've got David Lay on the show today. David is a clinical psychologist, an author, and also Jiu-Jitsu black belt. So welcome to the show, David. And why don't we start hard? People talk about this idea of masculinity. What is the definition of masculinity in your eyes?
You know, that's a good question, Stephan. When I talk about masculinity as a psychologist, I'm also a sex therapist. Most of my books have been about male aspects of male sexuality. And when I talk about masculinity, generally, I am talking about some of the consistent differences between males and females in terms of attitudes, behaviors, predispositions. Now, one of the things that, when I talk about masculinity, I am generally talking about group differences. So what that means is that, we see group differences between males and females, between men and women. I'm going to use those terms interchangeably. We see group differences between males and females very consistently in terms of things like the jobs that they choose. But what's interesting is that those group differences don't actually mean all that much when we're talking about individuals. So if we compare one man to one woman, they actually are likely to be more similar than different. The reason I think that that's important is that people get really defensive when we talk about masculinity or femininity, because they're like, well, I'm not that way, so that means that difference is not real. But when we see these differences so consistently at the group level, there is something important there, because those group differences inform the context within which we are learning about who and what we are.
So would it be akin to height, for example, to say that men on average are taller than women, but that doesn't mean that you can't have a woman who's taller than a man?
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's a perfect example. Similarly, in my career around sexuality, men in general masturbate more than women. Does that mean that there's not a woman out there who masturbates more than me? It doesn't. But we can talk about these group differences, and then that helps us to understand the context within which we're evaluating an individual.
Okay. Well, at the risk of, locking or painting ourselves into a corner, if we talk about masculinity as this masculine and femininity being on this spectrum, can you describe the far end of the spectrum at one end and then the far end of the spectrum on the other? Kind of creating this idea of strong masculinity versus strong femininity, acknowledging that there's a ton of overlap in the middle?
Right. What we talk about often in my work is those traditional stereotypes of masculinity and femininity. And so, the John Wayne versus the housewife kind of image. John Wayne, always acting macho, never crying, not admitting vulnerability or weakness, having to engage in typical traditional macho kind of behaviors. And then the stereotypical kind of housewife, stays at home, cooks, takes care of the, kids, is focused on satisfying her husband's needs, etc. Those are the outlier images. Now, how much those reflect reality is all in the eye of the beholder. One of the things that, I'm seeing in this conversation now at the at the global level, at the internet level, at the popular level is the influence of people like Andrew Tate, and that are invoking these very traditional and limited ideas of masculinity, and telling boys that if they're anything but that they are unmanly, that touching your own penis is gay, stuff like that is that extreme. And those same folks are also, elevating this trad wife kind of model of, again, the wife that stays home and has lots of kids, and, is submissive and subservient to her husband and husband's opinions. Again, these are these extreme models of masculinity and femininity that are being elevated in this really unrealistic kind of model these days.
How much of this is culturally constructed, and how much cultural difference do you see? Because clearly there are some traits that are, if not innate, trend strongly toward one, but like our ideas of what masculine is and our ideas of what feminine is are also widely variable from culture to culture and from time to time, in my experience.
Yes. So very much culturally driven. However, we have to acknowledge that by and large, the cultural differences emerge from some consistent biological realities. So that, while there have been female hunters and female warriors throughout history, the size difference and the effects of testosterone on physiology have led to there being a cultural expectation for males to be warriors and females generally not, right? So so we can see that culture emerges from some of those biological consistencies. But while polygamy, one man with multiple wives, is historically the most common form of marriage throughout human history, there have been cultures with polyandry, with one wife with multiple husbands. Those are much, much more rare and are typically tied to economic circumstances. So, if we look at that again as emerging from some of the consistent biological differences. Now, I do point out though that there's a unique and interesting kind of phenomenon called the gender equality paradox, and that is that cultures that have more egalitarian society, where women are allowed to have as many rights and independence as men, in those societies we actually see greater gender differences, with women more likely taking, for instance, traditionally feminine jobs, even though they're in a society where they could take more masculine jobs and not be tied to that. That for some reason in these more egalitarian societies, women and men are more likely to choose to be different.
Well, I think that you raise a really interesting point, and I want to carry it to combat sports in a second, but that there's the framework for social decision-making and then individual decision-making. And I think one of the challenges we have as a society is to create social frameworks where people can have authentic choice. Like, if you have the ability to have a social safety net, you are more likely to choose a path that authentically reflects you, as opposed to doing something that you hate simply because you don't want to end up homeless and on the street. That's one idea that I wanted us to discuss. Another one that I wanted us to discuss, I always use the example of PowerSlap to illustrate this concept. You mentioned some of the biological realities of, like, men tend to be, because of testosterone, larger, tend to be stronger. So this drives the image of, in ancient cultures, men as warriors and things of that nature. And these are general trends that don't necessarily apply to us as individuals, but those are general trends. The thing with that is when you equate that with toughness, strength, things that are generally positive, resilience, you go out and you provide for folks. it often gets taken to an extreme where you're tough in a way that is not intelligent. And I think this is limiting for men in the sense that, something like PowerSlap, which to me is the great example of, you should be tough and just let somebody hit you in the face. Or in an MMA fight, well, you should stand and bang, even if you know if you take that person down, they have no chance against you. I think that's limiting for men because although it's like, it sort of venerates the toughness skill, it's like, well, you can't be smart and just be like, okay, if I have a 100% chance to win this way, I could do this, but maybe I'll just let somebody hit me in the face without being able to defend myself at all.
Yeah. I might disagree with you that strength and toughness are inherently good. The example there is that, do we want, it's an amplifier, but if we have somebody who's a bad person, them being stronger and tougher is not a good thing for society. If we have bigger and tougher and stronger Nazis, this does not make society better.
Yeah.
I'm not against strength and toughness, and I've done what I can to cultivate that in my life, but I'm going to argue it's a value neutral thing or an amplifier of pre-existing characteristics that already exist within the person.
Yeah, I mean, I think we agree on that. My perspective is, if we're looking as an individual, for me as a man, regardless of my politics or whatever, I don't think it's a bad thing. Like, and this is where I think we have ceded maybe too much ground to the sort of rise and grind influencers, and this has gotten into toxicity. Is like, there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, I want to be stronger. Hey, I want to be tougher. There's everything right with that, and I don't think that's gendered. But for me, where it gets into extremism is you're like, well, push through, even if it's hurting you, even if it's hurting others. And of course, it gets into the will to dominate other people. But yeah, strength is definitely not something. I mean, all of this stuff is socially dependent, right? So.
I'm reminded a few years ago, the American Psychological Association put out a like position statement on masculinity, and it generated a whole lot of controversy. I was one of the people that was really challenged by it, because they posed kind of essentially the presumption that masculinity was inherently pathological. And that therapists and psychologists treating men should help men to be aware of the negative impacts of masculinity on their mental health. And the statement, made some assertions, for instance, that, that psychology had to apologize to women for ignoring women throughout history, that psychology had been largely made or developed by men, ignored, powerful people like Virginia Satir and Anna Freud, and it ignored that aspects of masculinity have shaped our world and our societies in incredibly positive ways. Assertiveness, the drive to change the world, to make things that haven't existed before, are things that we see in, inventors, in Thomas Edison, in Steve Jobs, people that have changed the world. That those aspects of masculinity that the Psychological Association was identifying as these things, this drive to be in charge, or this drive to dominate, these things make men unhappy and unhealthy. But those things also make men very happy and make the world a better place. And, you mentioned, Jeff, a moment ago, you mentioned toxic masculinity. And that is that's this modern kind of dialogue around, well, taking masculinity too far is I think kind of maybe the best sort of definition of it. And I can kind of get behind that, but I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that, these aspects of masculinity are double-edged swords and can do as much good as they do negative. As Stephan was just saying, that these things can be amplifiers for good or for bad. And I think what I try and encourage in men is greater self-awareness around these aspects, so that they're making decisions from a greater place of consciousness rather than instinct. And I also encourage men to unpack these ideas and values. I'm always asking men, where did you learn that idea? And are you sure that that idea is right? And oftentimes, I hear, well, this was something I heard on a podcast, or this is something that, my dad taught me. Now, are you sure that that fits today's world? And does it fit the life you want to live? Because I want people making these decisions for themselves and integrating it into an authentic, representation of who they are and who they want to be.
I was just wondering if the dividing line between masculinity, even hypermasculinity, and toxic masculinity might be an emphasis on oppressing others and a lack of empathy. So those are, when I try and say what is toxic masculinity, I identify those two things. What's your definition of toxic masculinity? Is it just all the masculine features to the extreme, or is it masculinity plus something else? Or do you reject the term altogether?
Well, clinically, I prefer to use the term hostile masculinity. And when we look at that, particularly in, for sex offenders and men who are engaged in criminal sexual behavior, hostile masculinity is antisocial kind of traits, feeling like the rules don't apply to them, low levels of empathy towards others, viewing women as, if not property, something that they are entitled to. Those are some of those main features. Now, and that gets to what you said, Stephan, in terms of dominating others. If somebody has low empathy for others, they're not going to care about their needs. They're going to let their personal selfishness trample over them. Those are the things that unfortunately, I think, again, a lot of what I regard as unhealthy discussion of masculinity is ignoring. I mean, I view men with self-control who are able to be empathic to others and support the growth and development of others as being more masculine in very healthy, positive ways.
I never feel more masculine or more like a man than when I have protected someone who can't protect themselves, or I've empowered someone to be the person that they want to be in the world. And I think I love the term hostile masculinity because I think it describes a lot of the features that make the type of masculinities we're talking about toxic. If you are hostile to others and have the urge to dominate them, I mean, to me, that is toxic. and so that sort of stuff makes a lot of sense. And so I think a lot of the types of masculinity that we see that do have positive traits in the world, the urge to protect other people, the urge to be good to your family, the urge to like help other folks become empowered to live their best lives. I think seizing back the rhetoric that these two are masculine traits, I think is really, really important.
I always forget his name, the actor that played Al Bundy.
Ed O'Neill.
Ed O'Neill, and black belt in jiu-jitsu, and I love his origin story that he was an actor and was getting in trouble for fighting too much in unhealthy ways. I think his producer, his agent, got him into jiu-jitsu, and he found this healthy outlet for those aspects of aggression and dominance that were coming out in unhealthy ways. But I remember this quote from him where he said, these martial arts movies where one guy, fights, 5 or 6 guys and beats them all, that's just not realistic. But he says, because of my training in jiu-jitsu, if I was in that fight, I could survive. That, I think, is a really powerful and confident statement that is strong, but not in that dominating way. That's really manly to me. But yeah.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. And like honestly, like one thing I find interesting about martial arts culture that's similar to a lot of trends we see in history. An outmoded theory in history is called the great man theory, right?
Mhm.
The man, come the time, come the man, and this one powerful man through his will, and it's always him, changes the world. Or in a martial arts movie, it's like, hey, I have learned the mystic martial arts, and here come 20 dudes trying to beat me up, and they can't, and I'm whooping all their asses. It's a fun fantasy, and it's not realistic, right? It's not real. People always ask me what the best martial art is against multiple attackers, and I'm like, none of them. You know, like you don't want to be attacked. I mean, I don't want to get in a fight with one guy, let alone 10 guys. But I think that, you know, and this is another feature, I think, too, of the type of masculinity that you're talking about, David, in that it's capable of nuanced thinking and intelligent and critical analysis. That, like, hey, is it really, it gets back to the thing I'm talking about with things like PowerSlap. It's like if you're saying like a man must face impossible odds where you can't win and you know you are getting a concussion, you know, is that really to me that's really limiting of what
Mhm.
masculinity can be. And if masculinity is like, yeah, you know this is bad and you have to do it anyway, that seems silly to me.
And must face it alone.
Mm.
Um, thinking about the Clint Eastwood movies, the spaghetti westerns. He rides in alone, he fights, and then he leaves alone. And there's this message in a lot of hostile masculinity that a real man doesn't need anybody else. And I think that's sad. It contributes to tremendous loneliness. Um, the In the men that I treat, um, it prevents men from, acknowledging the value of other people for them and in their lives. And my wife calls jiu-jitsu cuddling for alpha males, which I just love. I always have to acknowledge she's the one that came up with it. I see so many men who are starved for physical connection and affection. And I'll be honest, I genuinely think that that is one reason why jujitsu is so powerful emotionally for men, because so many men don't get touched anywhere else in their life. And that physical closeness, it generates neurochemicals in our brain, including oxytocin, that feeds bonding. But it also just feeds connection. I mean, I was born with one hand, a very obvious disability that is not very disabling. But up until I found jujitsu, I always worried that people didn't want to touch my arm, that they viewed my physical disability as, something deficient, something that could be caught, or that might hurt me if they touched them and stuff like that. I don't worry about that anymore, because in jujitsu, my arm is like my deadliest weapon. My people I train with call it my nubchuck, because I choke the hell out of people with it. And I've got an Ezekiel that you just can't block. And they learn very quickly. They may not want to touch my arm, but they're going to get touched by it, and they have to deal with it.
Yeah.
And smart guy, I can tell when somebody I'm training with knows what they're doing, because they defend against my arm very quickly. They know that that is my has to be a part of my game, and so they pay attention to it. Less experienced people figure that out. Smart guys, smart people pick that up, quickly. So I'm circling back, but jujitsu, I, I I think it has the opportunity to provide very healthy masculinity by teaching guys to connect with others, to touch others, to be with others in a valuable, healthy way, all moving forward in the same goals, learning how to do this thing better.
I think that's extremely powerful. And I want to elevate one thing that you said about that. You know, you mentioned the platonic touch aspect, which is really powerful, but also like the real-time problem solving in unique situations, right? Is it not manly to be like, oh, I've never seen someone with a body like this before? And it might be a situation like yours, or it might be like, oh, this dude's much bigger, this dude's much smaller, this person is radically flexible. I've never seen someone who's able to use this, and you, what makes jiu-jitsu, I think, amazing for everyone is that it will never be a solved game, because nobody's body is exactly like every else's body. And is it not awesome to be able to have the skill to know, like, I've never seen a body like that, and yet I will be able to, we're going to be all right. We're going to figure this out. And if I get tapped, that is an opportunity for me to educate myself, so the next time you try and Ezekiel me, maybe I have a better shot at stopping it.
I was a guy I trained with just, I think, 2 or 3 days ago. I noticed he was, favoring his wrist, and he had hurt it, and I said, I hope it gets better. And he says, yeah, but he says, having to deal with this is teaching me a new game. So even as everybody's body is different, our bodies change over time. I mean, my game is radically different now, 20 years later, than it was when I was in my early 30s and started training, and people called me a tornado because I was like going so hard and fast. Now, like you, Jeff, a lot of my game is using the gi to slow people down and get them to make mistakes, and that's a more mature game, and it fits my body, but it is something I've learned. And like you said, again, and this sounds like a sexist statement, and I don't mean it that way, but it is one of those differences, is that men are problem solvers. And that is one of the valuable aspects of masculinity, is that we want to figure things out, we want to fix things, we want to change things, we want to be the person that can fix the car, that can fix something, that can deal with this problem, that can protect. And jiu-jitsu is, just like you said, it's 7 minutes of problem solving.
One of the healthiest wrestling coaches that I ever had an amazing analogy. And I'm going to have two different analogies here, because everybody knows the story of the Gordian knot, right? You have this impossible knot, nobody can untie it. Alexander the Great comes along, takes out his sword, chops it in half. And you can take that one of two ways, either like, what an amazing problem solver, or you kind of cheated with a blunt force solution. And like many great stories, how you interpret it sort of affects things. And I think a lot of people interpret it as, if you're going to be dumb, you got to be tough, and you just plow on through, and which I think is a flawed interpretation, but a lot of people think that. One of the wrestling coaches I had would always say, be James Bond. At first, I didn't understand what he meant, but he's like, look, James Bond is never the biggest, strongest person. He's never the guy that, he fights people much bigger, whole organizations, but he figures it out. He has solutions, and sometimes that solution involves a tool, sometimes it just involves his wits. But it's not a situation where you're just bigger and stronger than everybody else. And I thought, particularly in wrestling, which is really, a very macho sport, to send that message to young folks, I think was really terrific.
I was talking a couple of days ago with another psychologist friend of mine who has recently gotten into jiu-jitsu, and his wife has joined as well. They're both white belts with 3 stripes now, I think, and we were talking about how his wife is really strong, and she prefers to go with men who can match her strength, so she can't overpower other women, and she has to learn technique. But of course, she has to be careful which guys she goes with. But he commented that there have been a couple of situations where guys went too rough with her, and just so happened the next guy that they rolled with was a brown or black belt who sort of tore into him. And you could look at that as being chauvinist, and you can look at that as being, kind of sexist, with this idea that the woman can't defend herself or can't protect herself. But also, I think it is a form of healthy masculinity, again, protecting and identifying to other men, hey, that's not our culture. We don't treat women that way. And, that's one of the things I've always paid attention to when I travel and I go to other gyms. I train with Gracie Baja. I have for my entire career. Very traditional school. but I travel a lot and go to other gyms, and I judge whether gyms are healthy places that I want to train at by how they treat women and children. If those people, if those more vulnerable adults are safe in this environment, then I think it's a place I want to be.
I completely agree that sort of a healthy aspect of masculinity is protecting people who are not as strong or as powerful or as lucky as you are. But you do see this term getting thrown around pejoratively. Have you heard people throw the accusation of white knighting?
Yeah.
Like, how dare you intervene here? You're not entitled, you're not... it kind of took me aback, because why wouldn't we want a world in which people protect, regardless of whether that person smaller or more vulnerable than you is male or female, regardless of they're older or younger, or in general, the more powerful people, in whatever context we're talking about, protect the less powerful people? I don't see any world in which that makes the world, I don't see any scenario in which that makes the world a worse place.
Yeah, I mean, I get the accusation is that this is not genuine. You're just being performative for the attention. I worked with adolescent sex offenders for many years, and oftentimes there was this question, well, is this youth actually being empathic, or are they just pretending to be empathic as they were progressing in treatment? And I said, I don't fucking care. Because if they can pretend to be empathic good enough that I can't tell that they're pretending, I'm not sure there's a difference.
A thing I tell the students all the time is we are who we pretend to be.
Yeah.
If you want to be tough, pretend to be tough. If you want to be a great jiu-jitsu student, what would a great jiu-jitsu student do? Act like that. And it's one of the things that, people use terms like pithy phrases to kind of try to belittle other people. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's kind of folks telling on themselves. I feel the same way about the phrase virtue signaling. It's like, well, you're just trying to signal that you're virtuous. I'm like, what should I be signaling? Should I be signaling that I'm not virtuous? And so I think for me, it really is about, David, to your point about outcomes, right? If a person pretends to be empathic and the outcome of that is a better environment and a healthier place, does it matter that they were pretending? And I would also, and you're a psychologist, I'm not, but I also kind of think if you act like something, habits form that way. Mm-hmm. And if you are pretending to be an empathic, kind person, I mean, if the outcome of that is you just always act like that, I'm okay with it.
And it does build over time. I mean, it's ridiculous to say this like this, but what psychology has learned now after 100 years is that the best treatment for depression is to act like you're not depressed. And that sounds ridiculous, but when people are depressed, they stop socializing, they stop, connecting to positive feelings, they stop doing the things that make them feel good. And our treatment is to tell people, do the things that you would do when you weren't depressed. And over time, it kind of fools your brain. Your brain starts going, well, I thought I was depressed, but I'm doing the things that I do when I'm not depressed. And so the neurochemistry starts flowing in the direction of not depression. We are what we do. And if you do empathy and kindness and healthy masculinity, then that's what you become.
Now, at the beginning of this conversation, you framed masculinity and femininity as a spectrum, and individuals can fall anywhere on that spectrum, regardless of what their body parts are or what their DNA is. And just like gender is a spectrum, and just like sex is a spectrum, and as a biologist, I'll defend that to the ends of the earth. Just because you've got an XY chromosome doesn't mean you have a dick, and just because you have a double X chromosome doesn't mean that you have boobs and a vagina. That's not the way biology works. But it is a spectrum, and it seems unfortunate but you're looking at things statistically, right? Like on average, people who are women tend to be more feminine. Why is it then that people who are trying to become more masculine, and especially so-called masculinity influencers, almost inevitably trend towards the alt-right? Why is it that somebody who starts out talking about weightlifting to make yourself stronger, it's really quite shocking when they don't end up in an anti-seed oil position, an anti-vaccine position, a pro-fascist position? Is it just that the idea of strength is good, regardless of whether it's your bench press, your clean and jerk, or your ability to dominate the political sphere through fascist-like tactics? Is it a conflation of the idea of strength? Or it seems almost inevitable that 90% of gym bros end up kind of towards the alt-right, and 95% of masculinity influencers end up towards the alt-right.
Yeah, there's, I'm not a sociologist, but there are those, just historical parallels that more conservative fascist societies and governments have always elevated these traditional conservative gender roles. The Nazis, the Hitler Nazi youth were prohibited from masturbating and told that masturbating, made them less manly. That's a great way to manipulate those young males, to make them insecure about their masculinity. And we see the same thing nowadays with the NoFap movement, that there is this there are these stressed and anxious youth, insecure about their male sexuality and their masculinity, and told that not to masturbate. Now, it's not coincidental that the NoFap movement is filled with misogyny and white supremacy, a whole lot of toxic and hostile masculinity, and is parallel, if not affiliated with white supremacy. And where does that all come from? I mean, I'm paranoid enough that I do think that these are initiatives that work covertly to create insecurity, that then allow people to be more susceptible to influence, to that great man, that strong man kind of idea that Jeff, identified. I mean, look at Putin, with this, again, this performative masculinity stuff. As people perceive him as more manly than me, his opinion now matters more. My second book is called Insatiable Wives. It's about, or actually it's my first book, I'm sorry. And it's about cuckolding. We didn't used to talk about cuckolding. Now it's like, on everybody's lips, MAGA people calling each other cuckold if they're not a real Republican and stuff. But what's fascinating is that, cuckolding is the fetish, or the idea of, your wife being with other men with your permission. We see that being more popular in more conservative areas, and in men who grew up.
I got to ask, how do we know this? How do we know? This is a popular accusation that gets thrown up, but how do we know this?
A couple of research studies, one by Justin Lehmiller, found that Republicans were more likely to fantasize about cuckolding. Democrats were more likely to fantasize about BDSM or domination. It's because of the taboo. The more taboo something is in your culture, the more likely some people are going to find violating that taboo to be really exciting. So the reason why we are seeing, and you can look at the Google searches, Google searches for cuckolding are more popular in more conservative, traditionally macho countries. Italy, I think last time I looked, was one of the countries that had the most Google searches for cuckolding per capita. And I remember I had this guy write to me from Germany, and he was literally a Nazi skinhead. And his fantasy, though, that he couldn't tell any of his peers, was about watching his wife with men of color, because that was so shameful and taboo, that the energy of it was exciting. The more we make masculinity this facade where you can't be vulnerable, the more likely we are feeding this excitement of escaping that. It's not a fiction that powerful men oftentimes fantasize about being dominated. There was some TV show, CEO or something like that, and the CEO was going home and getting dominated by a woman. The more we create this false two-dimensional image of masculinity, always being strong and never being weak and never being vulnerable, the more we create a craving for that in men that they oftentimes feel ashamed to pursue. And it creates this circular, self-defeating spiral.
I got one other grenade to lob at you. We've been talking about, one of the things we've been talking about is toxic masculinity or hostile masculinity. Is there such a thing as toxic or hostile femininity?
Yeah, I argue there is. The best example I see of it is intersexual competition, and women pulling down other women. There was one of the best studies I've ever seen on this was a research study where they had a group of women allegedly sitting in a waiting room waiting for the experiment to start, and a female assistant to the researcher comes in and tells the group that the experiment's going to be delayed. And the control variable was how she was dressed. The more sexually or attractively she was dressed, the more likely that the women in the room tore her to shreds when she walked out of the room. There's this book called Self-Made Man, and it's a woman who's a lesbian, and she used makeup and costuming to infiltrate male environments as a man. And she specifically was exploring this to see what it's like to be a man, to talk about male culture. And there was this thing where she was on a bowling league, and there was one guy who was about to play a perfect game, and everybody in the bowling alley stopped and watched and cheered him on. And the author, she said, you'd never see that in women. That in women, another woman's success takes away from the other women. Now, the argument is that this is because historically women had to compete with other women for, a mate. And, it's why women are by and large the group that is most against casual sex and most against, sex work, because sex and reproduction was their only commodity. The only thing that they had to trade to have stability and caregiving and such. Now, we don't live in that world anymore, but we do still see women competing with each other and pulling each other down in ugly ways.
Jeff, I know that, David, I know that you're short for time today. Jeff, is there anything else that you want to hit David with while we have access to him?
No, I think you've hit a lot of really, I think you've covered a lot of really interesting stuff and given me certainly some stuff to follow up on. I'm going to look up some of those studies that you talked about. I'm always interested to see the research about this sort of thing.
So what guidance can you offer somebody who wants to become more masculine, but doesn't want to become a complete asshole while becoming more masculine?
Really two things. I think, self-awareness, know thyself, was written on the Temple of Delphi in ancient Greece. And the second thing was nothing in excess. Know thyself and nothing in excess was what was written there. And the second thing, though, for me, beyond those two, I guess third thing, would be listening. If I could go back in time and tell, 12-year-old me anything, it would have been learn how to listen. As I became a therapist, I had to learn how to listen and listen really good. Listen to what is said and not said. Listen to what people say and what they mean. Those can be two different things. And I remember on the first date with my wife, she said, "Wow, I've never had a man listen to me like you listen." And that made me a little sad, actually, because she said most men talk at me. They're interested in me being impressed by them, and they think that that's going to get me in bed. But people want to be around somebody, not that talks at them, but that makes them feel better. And being listened to makes people feel better. Again, I want to be a man that knows myself, knows my limitations and acknowledges them, problem solves around them. I want to be a man who doesn't take things to extremes, doesn't have to. And I want to be a man that people want to be around because they feel better when they're around me. Again, it's one of the things I love in Jiu-Jitsu is now being able to teach and to, in the moment, with a white belt or a blue belt, I can tap them 5-6 times, however many times, whatever. But what I really love is tapping them and then showing them how to defend against what I just did, making them better. And it makes me better by making them better.
I think that's very astute. Like that the rising level helps us all, right?
Yeah.
I learn a lot by teaching, and if you have 20 great training partners, you're all going to get superlative. If you have 5 good training partners, it's a lot harder.
Yeah, my professor, I've gotten all my belts under him, is Roberto Alencar, known as Tusa, and he one of my moves is I use my nub, I use my short arm, and I wrap it inside the sleeve of somebody's wrist, of their gi. And of course the rule is no fingers in the gi. Well, I don't have any fingers on my arm, so sorry, ref. And I get a hell of a good grip that is so powerful that people really struggle, and sometimes I can get a wrist lock just from the grip. But Tusa said, "Okay, David, that's a really good move, but it is so good that you now have to start teaching people how to defeat it. Otherwise, you can't keep doing it." Okay, cool. It's a new problem. Now I got it. Now I got to solve it.
Yeah, that's an incredible teaching tool as well, because then you get all the better at the move, having
Right.
people know how to defend it, and now you
100%.
That's great. That's great teaching by Tusa there.
So you mentioned your first book, Insatiable Wives. What else have you written? And I'm assuming people can find it where they find books.
Yeah, wherever you find books. I've got a website, davidlayphd.com. And my first book is Insatiable Wives. My second book is called The Myth of Sex Addiction, because I took on the whole concept of sex addiction industry as being a moralistic enterprise that is applying traditional values around sexuality and masculinity in the guise of mental health, and really imposing, homophobia, that real men don't cheat, real men don't, have sex with other men, real men don't masturbate. All this stuff is embedded in there. And then my third book is called Ethical Porn for Dicks, A Man's Guide to Responsible Viewing Pleasure. And I wrote that book for guys, because guys don't really read, unfortunately. And there's so much out there that is just, really inaccurate pseudoscience about pornography. There are men that struggle with pornography use. Most of their struggle is because they were taught that if you masturbate or watch porn, that is immoral and shameful. And then they watch porn and feel great while they're watching porn, and then afterwards they're overwhelmed with guilt and shame because they're engaging in a behavior that is inconsistent with their morals and values, because they haven't sat down and done that work that I talked about unpacking their values. And so that book helps guys to identify responsible and healthy ways to use pornography, and how to change their behavior if they're using pornography in unhealthy ways.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for making time today, David. Good luck with your training and good luck with your practice.
Thank you, guys. Great to meet you both. I hope I get a chance to roll with both of you one day.
I'd love it. Thanks a lot, David.
Take care.